What is up, everybody? Jeremy Eisenfire here, and welcome to the channel. Episode 5 of Severance is here, entitled Trojan's Horse, and in this episode we finally get to see the shocking aftermath of everything that happened in Episode 4 during the Ortbo, and the consequences can certainly be felt all throughout the severed floor, as we not only bid farewell to one of our 4 MDR employees in Irving, but we also see the fallout of the Helena infiltration and how exactly Mark and Helly both choose to respond to it. And then, of course, we also see that it is certainly not all sunshines and kittens when it comes to being a Lumen employee, as Milchick has his first ever performance review as head of the severed floor, and it certainly does not go as he expected. But the episode starts off with a very interesting scene where we finally meet this mysterious courier that goes from optics and design to the mysterious exports elevator, as we see Burt's former partner Felicia handing the courier what appears to be dental tools. And one thing that I found was very interesting was the particular song that the courier was whistling on his way to and from Optics and Design, which of course is The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald by Gordon Lightfoot, a song that depicts the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald in Lake Superior. And some believe this song is a direct reference to the painting Kier Invites You to Drink of His Water, which many believe depicts Kier overlooking the expanse that is Lake Superior itself. And while this is a very interesting theory, to say the least, I think that this painting of Kier is more of a direct homage to the original Mary Shelley Frankenstein cover, of Victor Frankenstein overlooking a very similar expanse, standing in the very same manner. Especially when you learn all of the very deep similarities between Kier Eagan and Victor Frankenstein himself. And if you want to learn a little bit more about their connection, I will leave a link to our video in the description below. But next, we follow up with Outie Mark and his continuation of the reintegration process, and apparently Ragabi has been living in his basement just as Petey once did, as she goes through this reintegration process with him. Apparently it is not something that is just going to gradually happen overnight. Reintegration is more of a long process that takes more than one procedure, apparently, as Mark asks Ragabi when exactly they can continue. And it seems like she has him on a very strict post-op regimen, one that apparently Petey did not follow, which could have contributed to his death. One thing Ragabi said in Season 1 was that Petey did not follow her post-op rules, and as long as Mark does, I get the feeling he will have a much better chance at success. But next we catch up with Helena Eagan returning to Lumen after the Ortbo. After, of course, she was exposed by Irving for pretending to be Helly, things have certainly changed for Helena, as she does not want to ever return to the severed floor yet again. But it seems like the pressure is being put on her both by Lumen and by her own father to not only return to the severed floor, but to also relinquish control back to her innie, someone who already tried to kill her once, and something that Helena does not want Helly to attempt again. So you can certainly understand her misgivings about returning to the severed floor and relinquishing that control. And on the other hand, you can totally see why Helena wanted a little bit of Helly's life for her own in the first place. How she sees Helly as having a certain measure of freedom that she herself will never have, being the corporate pawn that she is. Which, if anything, just makes Helena's betrayal of Helly that much worse, considering she's been through that before herself. But ultimately, she is convinced to return to the severed floor and relinquish control back to Helly, as they make it abundantly clear that Mark needs her to work. And according to Lumen, Mark completing the Cold Harbor case is going to be remembered as some of the most important work in human history, and with him getting closer and closer at 86% complete now, they cannot afford to have any more mistakes. And looking ahead later on to the Severance Season 2 finale, the episode is entitled Cold Harbor, so I get the feeling we will indeed find out what this case file is this season. I don't imagine them carrying this over to Season 3, not without at least revealing it. But next, we catch up with our severed employees returning to the MDR floor, with them confronting Milchick and wanting answers for not only what Helena was doing pretending to be Helly, but also answers about why Irving is missing as well. And here we see the deep betrayal on Helly's face when she realizes just how much Helena has betrayed her, and how she not only stole her body for a single day, but seemed to be doing this over an extended period of time. And one thing we notice throughout the episode is Helly constantly looking for Mark for reassurance and answers as to what really happened. But unfortunately, Mark comes off as incredibly cold towards Helly and incredibly distant, saying that maybe he didn't know who she really was, which I imagine, if nothing else, is certainly making Helly feel very uncomfortable, to say the least, as I imagine she would hope that Mark would have noticed the difference. And to make matters even worse, Mark refuses to tell Helly exactly what happened and exactly what Helena did with her own body, something Mark certainly needs to come clean with sooner rather than later. After all, if Helly does find out later on from somebody else that Helena did sleep with Mark and it doesn't come from him, that is going to make things way worse between them, and that is something they probably will not be able to recover from. Which is why I did really enjoy both occasions when Mark gets called out in this episode, both by Mr. Milchick at the end and by Dylan himself during Irving's funeral. When our MDR employees return to the severed floor and realize that Irving will not be returning, Dylan requests a funeral for him so they can properly grieve, something that Milchick surprisingly agrees to, which again is another example of when we see Mark being a little bit colder and a lot more distant than he usually is, while agreeing to the funeral for Irving, but also stating that it can't take too long, something that any Mark usually would never say. And during the funeral procession, Mark also starts to be a little bit cold again, which Dylan does call him out for, stating to him right in front of Helly, "Did you tell her that your wife was Miss Casey?" Something that Mark had failed to disclose to Helly up until this point, even though Helly has been trying to get the truth out of Mark all day about what really happened up there. Overall, I was definitely very surprised at Mark's reaction to everything that was going on. I thought at the very least he would come clean about what Helena did inside the 10. If nothing else, that's at least the one thing he owes her the truth about. But next, we see Mr. Milchick's first upcoming Lumen performance review ever since being head of the severed floor. And yet again, we see Milchick trying to extend an olive branch of sorts to Natalie, considering she and him are the only ones who had ever been through the shared experience that Milchick had earlier this season when receiving those paintings. It seems like he is desperately reaching out for a potential ally here, yet Natalie isn't as responsive as I think he's hoping she would be. And unfortunately, it only gets worse from there for Milchick as the performance review is underway, as it appears there are a few complaints that have already been lodged against him, including the use of too many big words and the improper use of paperclips. Two complaints that undoubtedly came from Minnie Milchick herself, as she had a very interesting smile on her face when mentioning Milchick's performance review earlier in the episode, as we see her questioning Milchick's methods of leadership, stating that he should not allow the Innies to even have a funeral for Irving, as it makes them feel too much like people. I must say, I did not know Minnie Milchick was this devious. Who knows, maybe she really is gunning for his job. But it seems like Lumen's biggest point of contention with Mr. Milchick was the Ortbow, and the devastating consequences that it had, which not only led to the firing of a valued severed employee in Irving, but also led to the discovery of Helena pretending to be Helly on the severed floor for multiple weeks. And for Lumen, anything that slightly jeopardizes Mark S. completing the Cold Harbor file is something they simply cannot accept, especially with them being so close to finishing it now, as we see Lumen begin to lean on Milchick a little bit harder to get him to tighten the leash, of which he agrees to do. Which is going to be very interesting to see how that plays out over the next few episodes. Are we going to start to see a much more strict and stern Milchick, maybe a little more akin to Miss Cobell? After all, Milchick did state in the review that he wanted to be a different kind of leader, that he was no Miss Cobell. But with Lumen now leaning on him to maybe be a little bit more strict, I wonder if we are going to see a little bit of a change in Milchick's leadership, and the amount of leeway that he ultimately gives the MDR employees. And it seems like Milchick is already beginning to tighten said leash, as we get that very interesting scene of him stepping inside the elevator with Mark as Mark is getting ready to leave, and how bluntly honest that Milchick is with Mark, asking if he has yet to disclose what really happened between Helena and Mark on the Ortbow. A line that was delivered with precision by Trammell Tillman. And I get the feeling that this is something that Mark needed to hear out loud. Not only was he being incredibly cold and distant to Helly in this episode, but he's not being truthful as well by not disclosing exactly what Helena did with Helly's body. And hopefully hearing it said out loud like this in such a blunt manner by Mr. Milchick will finally get Mark to realize that he needs to fess up and tell her the truth once and for all. We also get a very interesting scene between the Audis of Irving and Burt as they meet for the very first time. We saw earlier in the season that Audi Burt had been following Irving to this phone booth as he goes to make these mysterious phone calls, with Burt explaining his reasoning for following him was wanting to get to know who Irving was after he came banging on his door in the middle of the night, which apparently did cause some problems between Burt and his husband Fields, with Burt explaining that Lumen fired him not too long ago because his innie carried on an illicit relationship with another severed employee, with Burt and Irving both realizing in this moment that it was indeed their innies who carried on that relationship. And with Burt looking to smooth this over, he invites Irving over for a ham dinner, which of course will not be awkward at all. So it should be interesting to see how this progresses down the road. After all, it seems like they are already flirting with each other a tiny bit, and with the added fact of knowing that their innies already fell for each other once, it looks like the seed has already been planted for both of them. But then, of course, the episode ends with Mark talking to Ragabi about wanting to continue the reintegration process, with her urging him to wait one more day. As we start to see Audi Mark begin to reintegrate a little bit more, as he finally has his very first memory of seeing Miss Casey inside the Severance Hall. Which I imagine, if nothing else, is going to be giving Audi Mark the confirmation that he needs to know that his wife didn't in fact die in that car accident and she has been on the severed floor this entire time. For Mark, I imagine it's one thing to hear that your wife is still alive, but to actually see it and remember it for yourself is something else entirely. So it should be interesting to see how this motivates Mark going forward to try and find his wife that much more. But overall, it was a pretty interesting episode taking a look at the aftermath of the Orkbo and all of the devastating revelations that happened therein. The consequences seem to be felt both far and wide on the severed floor and both in the real world about what happened, and it seems like we are going to continue to feel those consequences for the rest of the season. And with Innie Irving gone, it looks like we are about to begin a new chapter as we start to learn a little bit more about Audi Irving and what kind of person he really is, as out of all 4 of the employees, his Audi is probably the most mysterious in terms of not knowing anything about him really, and what his real motives are, and of course what these mysterious phone calls mean and who he's talking to on the other side. But overall, I give this episode a solid 8 out of 10. It was definitely a good aftermath episode after having such a big one in episode 4, and I look forward to see where episode 6 takes us, which ironically is entitled Attila, most likely referring to Attila the Hun, who was famous for his military conquests of the Hun Empire during his reign of 434 until the time of his death in 453. But that is going to do it today for our episode 5 breakdown of Trojan's Horse, and definitely leave your thoughts and comments down below. What did you think of episode 5, and what are some of your predictions going forward? And as always, I want to give a big thank you to everybody out there for watching. Keep those tinfoil hats on, folks, and I will see you on the next one.
Now. Goodbye, Marcus.
Wait!